From Sephiroth to Handsome Jack, a villain has the potential to completely dominate a game. Whether it's through clever writing, a sinister end goal, or just an outrageous personality, the history of gaming is littered with iconic baddies. But what happens to those villains that start out strongly but end up tailing off into the waste bin thanks to their developers? Whether it be through stupid deaths, shocking new depictions, or not understanding the brilliance they had on their hands until it was too late, let's take a look back at some of gaming's most iconic villains that were inexplicably ruined by their developers. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 iconic video game villains ruined by developers. Number 10. Tiny Tiger, Crash Bandicoot. Whilst he's never been as important as the likes of Yuka Yuka or Neo Cortex, Tiny Tiger has had a pretty significant part in the Crash games since Crash 2. And Tiny Tiger immediately made a splash with his bulging biceps and IQ, which we're going to describe as limited. Against all the mad scientists and geniuses Crash typically goes up against, it was refreshing to have a baddie who was just content with bashing the Bandicoot to a pulp. It also helped that Tiny Tiger's boss battles were some of the best in the series. However, by the time the series got to Crash of the Titans in 2007, it was clear the developers were committed to taking things from mediocre to completely outlandish. The game is renowned for ripping up the formula and serving up some of the most head-scratchingly bizarre design choices of the series. But in the case of Tiny Tiger, his depiction in the game was almost enough to crucify the character from the series altogether. All his beautiful butchness was stripped away and his voice was changed to a Mike Tyson ripoff. It's one of the most infamous decisions in Crash history, and one that continues to baffle fans to this day. Number 9. Rodrigo Borgia, Assassin's Creed. In real-life history and the virtual world of Assassin's Creed, Rodrigo Borgia was one bad egg. Introduced as the mysterious cloak-wearing puppeteer working in the shadows, his scheming saw him not only kill the male members of Ezio's family, but ascend all the way to the papacy as Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He's one of the most significant figures from the Renaissance and makes for the perfect enemy for Ezio and players to go up against, which made his depiction in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood all the more baffling. Despite taking place immediately after AC2, Brotherhood's Rodrigo is no longer the sinister Grandmaster of the Templars, but rather an increasingly decrepit old man, constantly shoved to the sidelines and unable to keep a lid on his nephew, Cesare. It's understandable why Ubisoft wanted a set of new villains for their new game, but seeing Borgia just be a shell of his former self in this one was really jarring. Players don't even get an interaction between Ezio and Rodrigo through the entire game. The number one target, and still the sitting Pope from the previous game, suddenly finds himself with just a couple of cutscenes before finally being killed off by being force-fed a poisoned apple. Rodrigo deserved better. Number 8. Dr. Eggman, Sonic the Hedgehog. The history of Sonic the Hedgehog as a franchise has been a slow-burning demise at the hands of its developers, and few parts of the series showcase this fall from grace quite like its big baddie, Dr. Ivo Robotnik, aka Eggman. First introduced in the original entry to the series, Eggman is a mad scientist with the smarts required to create an entire arsenal of mechanical monstrosities. But whilst his robots and mechanisms continued to expand and diversify, Eggman as a character never did. Sometimes the butt of all the game's jokes, sometimes more sinister in his motives, his missions in each new entry never deviated too far from the classic Eggman's up to some mischief, collect these things, beat up his robots, and stop him. This was something that, to be fair, Sega looked to finally address in the most recent Sonic Frontiers. Eggman was given more of a backstory and insights into his deeper personality, including his conflicts and motivations, finally confirming to players that this was a character that could actually have some development behind him. But at the same time, this only happened to show players how much character development they've been denied with Eggman over the last 2 or so decades. Number 7. Waluigi, Super Mario. When Wario was introduced as the new baddie for the series in Super Mario Land 2, it was clear there was very little to this guy other than he's like Mario, but bad. However, in the years since, Wario has grown to become one of the most fleshed out and recurring characters in the Nintendo arsenal. Sadly, the same can't necessarily be said for his right-hand man, Waluigi. Making his debut in 2000 with Mario Tennis, whether it be his impeccable fashion sense or devilish good looks, Waluigi has become one of the most popular villains for the Mario Brothers. But for one reason or another, Waluigi has been shelved as a bit part player by Nintendo, only being wheeled out to give Wario a partner in the Mario Party titles. And even then, Nintendo has shown that even that's an honor they're planning to take away from our mustache-twirling baddie. Mario Kart 7, for instance, didn't see Waluigi playable, with Nintendo claiming he was too creepy to be included. It's a long-running joke for Nintendo fans how little of the spotlight Waluigi gets given, and there's no denying the company has badly missed out on an opportunity to create a villain potentially capable of rivaling the greats like Wario or Bowser. Number 6. Firefly, Batman Arkham. Whilst he's not exactly been one of Batman's most feared adversaries, Firefly has been a standard villain across all kinds of Batman media since the 1950s. And ahead of the release of Arkham Origins in 2013, it looked as though this pyromaniac might finally be getting his fair share of the spotlight. For the presentation of the character and his personality, Warner Bros. Montreal and Rocksteady did a stellar job in reimagining the villain across Batman Arkham Origins and Batman Arkham Knight. Unfortunately, presentation aside, there's not a whole lot more that the developers put into Firefly in either entry, especially when you compare him to those around him. He's decked out with some military-grade equipment and certainly has incentive enough to bring down the bat, but his fleeting time on screen just sees them more obsessed with starting fires and terrorizing Gotham's locals. For one of the big baddies meant to kickstart a new era of villains for the Arkham series, there was so much more that could have been done with one of DC's untapped gems. Number 5. Skullface, Metal Gear Solid. Skullface was first introduced in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain's snappy prologue, Ground Zeroes. His Western outfit and ghoulish face, combined with a mysterious past, delivered masterfully by James Horan's vocal performance, set him up as the big baddie every player wanted to take down. Sadly, what players were served up is a perfect example of the devs not realizing what they had until it was too late. For starters, Skullface is barely in the game. His screen time across Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain barely amounts to 30 minutes, a criminally low number made even worse by the decision to strip the series back from the glossy cinematic feel of its predecessors. Instead of gradually dropping in revelations about said mysterious past and motives throughout the game, Skullface notoriously dumps Snake in a Jeep and dumps every last drop of exposition he has on him. His one big sequence with the player lasts over 10 minutes, and then, to add insult to injury, he's brought to an end when he's crushed by Metal Gear Sahelanthropus. Number 4. Joel and Ellie, The Last of Us. The entire point of The Last of Us is to demonstrate that in the cruelest of circumstances, there are no such things as heroes or villains, only survivors. But being the only two playable protagonists in the game, it makes sense that Joel and Ellie are seen as the heroes of The Last of Us. But ask Abby or any of the hundreds of relations to the victims they've killed, or hell, literally anyone living on the planet that's been denied a vaccine because of Joel's selfishness, and he's certainly hovering much closer to that villain tag. Regardless, Naughty Dog created such a layered, complex, and genuinely enthralling character in Joel that the decision to one last chance to avoid Last of Us 2 spoilers here, and I'm gonna tell you what happens right now. Kill him off barely after the title card fades out in The Last of Us 2 is still a controversial one with so many. The dynamic between Joel and Ellie was the centerpiece of what made The Last of Us such an immersive and engaging story, and there's no denying some of that magic is missing in its sequel without it. What's more, it kinda opens a can of worms where Ellie finds herself painted as the villain and after bloody vengeance that never feels entirely justified. Number 3. Thanos, Guardians of the Galaxy. You don't have to be a Marvel fan to know that Thanos is the big baddie of the superhero world. After all, the only thing bigger than his kill count in Infinity War is the amount of money that the movies netted. And so his inclusion in a big blockbuster video game was about as inevitable as things come. What wasn't so predictable, however, was just how butchered this appearance would be. Prior to the launch of the Guardians of the Galaxy series from Telltale, all the promotional materials centered around this being a Thanos showdown for the ages. Instead, what players got was 25 minutes of a poor man's imitation of the Eternal, a lackluster boss battle, and then a thoroughly underwhelming death at the end of the first chapter of the game. Obviously an attempt at subverting player expectations, people still didn't understand why Telltale wouldn't take advantage of having a license to such a popular baddie, and why they seemed hell-bent on making him look like a total fraud. Remember those times when Thanos was the biggest threat to the galaxy and was actually portrayed like that? Yeah, fun times. Number 2. Derek Simmons, Resident Evil. When Resident Evil 5 made the decision to kill Albert Wesker off, Capcom suddenly found themselves in a tricky situation. After over a decade's worth of investment, Wesker had become the big baddie of the series, and now the company needed to find a suitable replacement for Resi 5's ambitious sequel. Thankfully, the cold, calculating, morally ambiguous Derek Simmons seemed to be the perfect choice, right? Well, sort of. In Resident Evil 6, Simmons is the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States and the man behind the nuclear destruction of Raccoon City. His combination of a calm exterior, far-reaching influence through politics and power, and a relentless pursuit for security and stability that would lead him to even assassinating President Adam Benford. It looked as though Capcom were really starting to explore the angle of governments being the biggest customers for shady suppliers like Umbrella by the time Resi 6 came out, with Simmons being the perfect antagonist to epitomize this. Instead, what players got with Simmons in Resident Evil 6 was a shadow of what it could have been. Not only does he not even come close to making it through the whole game, but even his final boss battle feels like just another RE grunt players are tasked with taking down. He infects himself, turns into another hideous monster, and we bet you can guess the rest. Number 1. Vars, Far Cry. To borrow a DJ Khaled phrase, the whole situation of Vars Montenegro being ruined by developers might be a case of suffering from success. Michael Mando's legendary antagonist from Far Cry 3 has gone down as one of the most iconic video game villains of all time. Enigmatic and unhinged, his cutscenes remain some of the most celebrated moments in the Far Cry series, and his contrast to protagonist Jason Brody gave the story a sense of depth as players dove deeper into the Rook Islands. What's more, Ubisoft went all out in promoting the game with Vars as the center of attention. Michael Mando also appeared in various spoof bits of material advertising the Far Cry experience, leaving few doubting that this was going to be one of the best represented villains in gaming history. It would be great to go back to the game's release in 2012 and relive the collective gasp when everybody realized that this iconic baddie was killed off at the game's halfway point. On a first playthrough, most probably don't even realize they've killed off their main foe for good when a strange dreamlike sequence ends with Jason ramming a knife in his gut. To this day, it's safe to say every Far Cry fan looks up at their posters of Vars with the thought of, what were you thinking, Ubisoft? That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other iconic video game villains ruined by developers. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDowell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.